A warm welcome from Vienna, Austria. Just to give you a short overview of what will be the input from my side, I divided it into two parts. The part one, which will follow soon, is about some general design options for financial incentives and an overview of the approaches in the countries of Austria, Switzerland, Germany, and Liechtenstein. In the second part, I would like to focus more on the discussion of the pros and cons of financial subsidies. Also, the issue of COVID-19, which might be a current challenge and might be interesting for you. And to end with some kind of general reflection about why companies train or do not train. And the very important issue from my point of view is it money that really matters? So the first part is about the design options and the approaches in these kind of German-speaking dual VAT countries. If one is looking at financial incentives that exist, one might categorize these according to different dimensions. One is you can design financial incentives like in a direct way or as indirect subsidies. Well, a direct subsidy is just simply the target groups, usually the companies, but it may also be apprentices, get money. Indirect subsidies also exist in these countries, and kind of indirect subsidies where you can't see money flows directly is, for example, if a company has training expenses and these companies can offset these training expenses against taxable profit. Another way is, for example, a way in Austria, there for every employee and also for every apprentice, generally there are social contributions to pay by the company. One can waive, for example, these social contribution payments of companies for apprentices. And the third typical way for indirect subsidies is done in Switzerland, is preferential treatment in public tender. So if a training company is engaged and takes an offer for a public tender, it might be treated preferentially. Second dimension of financial incentives is if you give them in a basic general way or in a criteria-based way. Basic just simply means, well, you pay or give a certain amount of money to training companies per apprentice or per training finished. For criteria-based subsidies, this is another way of giving the subsidies. You have to set up some criteria that companies and training companies have to fulfill, and usually afterwards, these companies are reimbursed for their expenses. An example would be if a company is investing extra money to prepare apprentices for the final exam, or if companies take part in World Euroskills and therefore have a lot of training. These might be criteria-based subsidies. Another way or another dimension how to design subsidies is a sectoral approach or a cross-sectoral approach, regional versus federal. So meaning some subsidies or maybe training funds designed on a sectoral industry sector branches, cover branches, the companies there, or cross-sectional, meaning all training companies in a country might get it, or can also divide it with respect to regional versus federal. So, for example, in Switzerland, the regional approach is very prominent. In Austria, we only have federal subsidies. Last but not least, of course, who is the target groups, or who are the target groups for financial incentives? Typically, and the focus here for us is training companies, but of course, also individuals, meaning usually young people, can be a target group, or it can be, the target group can be in a way the system level, an approach that Switzerland is very prominent for, meaning that you try to finance the dual vet governance system. For example, when it comes to design vet programs. And of course, if you give money, the money must come from where? Money is not growing on the trees. So basically, there are two options where money can come from. One is from taxpayers' money out of the federal, local, regional budgets, public budgets, or another way, typical training funds, is it that it's by employer contributions. So companies pay into a fund, and those who train get money out of it. And of course, especially for these fund solutions, there's the hot question, so to say, is the membership in the fund for the companies voluntary or compulsory? So can companies choose to be part of the fund, or have all companies, or all companies of a sector, if you follow a sectoral approach, have to contribute into this fund, and the training companies might get out money from it. So these are kind of basic dimensions when thinking about how to design financial incentives one has to reflect on. So just a brief view how these incentives are designed in Austria, Germany, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. The interesting thing is all of these countries, except Liechtenstein, have financial incentives. But in no country, do incentives cover training investment of companies. So meaning that only a part of them, of the investment of companies is offset, so to say, by financial companies. How these three countries, Austria, Germany, differ also in the main goals of the incentives. In Austria, we have basic subsidization. So every training company gets for each of its apprentices a certain amount of money. And we have also additionally financial incentives for specific goals, so criteria-based, for companies with extra quality and for target groups. Germany is following a very different approach. There the focus is on the demand side. So the financial incentives are geared for apprentices, and sometimes for, or also for the supply side, meaning the companies. But there specifically, these incentives shall foster training alliances among training companies, or sector-specific additional super company training centers. And in Switzerland, again, a very different approach. There usually, basically, these incentives shall foster apprenticeship training in general. As I mentioned, these kind of building up and supporting the governance structure, like curriculum development and all things like that. And also like financing for accreditation of training companies and approaches like that. So very different approaches in the countries. And all four countries also have indirect subsidization. All four countries have tax deduction for training expenditures. And Austria has waiving of non-labor costs. So companies do not have to pay the social security contributions for their apprentices. This is done or waived. In Switzerland, they have preferential treatment in public tenders. So the main message from this kind of overview is all countries have financial incentives, but very different goals, and that's why they are also very different approaches. The second part of my presentation will deal, as I mentioned, with the pros and cons of financial incentives, a little bit reflecting on COVID-19, and then why do companies train or not train, and the big issue about does money really matter. So from my point of view, the pros and cons of financial incentives. From an economic point of view, it looks rather simple because theory says, well, incentives may be given if there's massive underinvestment in training due to market failures. So market failures, for example, can be, and that's always a very prominent aspect that is discussed, if poaching exists, meaning companies training young people, these young people leaving the training company after they finish training. So the investment of the companies doesn't pay off. If that exists in a huge amount, that may lead that companies reduce their training. So underinvestment in training is the equilibrium outcome. The second problem might be that training companies might have to train young people or their apprentices when they start a lot of general skills, because many educational systems, compulsory skill systems, do not provide appropriate general skills after leaving obligatory schooling. A third topic can be asymmetries and uncertainties. If that exists to a very high degree, and COVID-19 might be a current example of that, also the outcome might be underinvestment in training. So there are just some reasons why it might be possible, useful, and meaningful to use financial incentives. Yet, what one has to say, it's very hard really to find valid ex-ante indicators and criteria to really filter out those training companies that should be subsidized. The basic issue there is not to give too much financial subsidies because there might be a negative system consequence. Companies shall train because they want to invest in their future skilled staff, and not because they get public money. And only if they get and only if the motivation to train young people to get future skilled staff, then we have this kind of link between qualification demand and between supply for apprenticeship places. And as a second dimension, then you have a systemic inroad into the quality of training. If a company is training its own future skilled staff, then it is very much interested, so to say, intrinsically, to provide good quality of training. If it's just training because it gets a lot of public money, then you might also lose this link to the quality of training and undermine the quality of company training. So there are some issues to think about. What can be seen from the existing schemes, or at least from those I had the chance to have a look into it, that all subsidies entail windfall gains, meaning you will subsidize training companies that would have trained also in the situation when there are no subsidies. So this is a kind of wasting money, be it public money or coming from a training fund, doesn't matter. It's a big issue, windfall gain. What's also a very important aspect is that, and especially when people think about to reduce these danger of windfall gains, then you're very fast thinking to trying to tailor-make very accurate financial incentives with a danger of becoming too high criteria complexity, because what the result of that will be that you need a massive administration to govern these kind of complex incentive schemes, as well as you may run into the danger of raising information costs for companies, because companies, it's very hard for them then in that situation to inform about the criteria, what they need, how to prove that they fulfill these criteria to get the money. So it's kind of trade-off between accuracy, criteria complexity, and administration, as well as information cost. A third issue and problematic with financial incentives is that once they are established, they're very hard to overcome. It's politically usually almost impossible to skip incentives if they exist, even though they might make no sense anymore. Yes, there are some arguments that subsidies may trigger companies to train, especially also in countries or for countries where dual VAT is starting. But often it's very hard to define what's the first time training company, what are additional training places. In Austria, for some years ago, we had a scheme that tried to foster dual VAT, tried to bring in companies that didn't train up to that time, and others that already trained, but the idea was that they should offer more training places, and the experience there was we produced a lot of windfall gains. So this scheme was skipped. And another issue is what will companies think about incentives, especially when it comes to when they are financed by a levy scheme, meaning that they have to pay into a fund. Will they think that's a kind of an unfair tax for them? Or will it be a fair redistribution scheme so that everybody has to pay in, but those companies who train get some money out of it are subsidized? The country experiences there are very different. Of course, non-financial aspects of incentives exist too. You just can say, well, it's our political goal, especially when it's the financing base is taxpayers' money, that the state, the public side, the government says, well, we want explicitly to support training companies. We know all these problems, windfall gains, stories like that, but we want to send out a positive social signal that dual VAT is important and that the engagement of training company is very important. And as we already mentioned, these kind of aspects of redistribution between training and non-training companies has the dimension of fairness. What was interesting, at least from the 4 countries, the German-speaking countries with long-established training systems, is there's a very limited, or there's evidence that there's limited relevance of the free rider problem, so the poaching that young people might leave, and that will dampen the engagement of companies in dual VAT. If that result holds true also for countries that want to start or to reform their VAT system and going to in the direction of dual VAT, is still open and is still a topic of discussion. So the evidence there is very limited. COVID-19, quickly. When talking about COVID-19 and the potential implications of it, it's very much depends on how deep and how long will the recession be that follows the lockdowns of many countries. Will there be second, third waves of pandemic outbreaks in the future? What will the policy reactions be? So it's very hard to figure out what the future will bring. So from a more theoretical point, what might be potential consequences for training companies out of COVID-19? The one thing is, due to these hopefully short-term shutdowns, companies might have temporarily liquidity constraints. If the economic consequences are longer lasting and deeper and more harmful, then that might go or feedback into the demand side of the market. And of course, the aspect of uncertainty, well, next waves and possible policy directions, it's not clear what that means. That will create or deepen uncertainty. And that will have, the last 2 points might have tremendous influence on the future demand for skilled labor, might because of economic downturn, deep recessions, also have a consequence that the future demand for skilled labor is reduced. So from my point of view, yes, thinking about financial incentives for or to fight COVID-19 might work and might have reasons when it comes to short-term, medium-term liquidity constraints of training companies. But if the longer-lasting effect, so the effect of the economy in the recession, turns out it's highly questionable from my point of view, even if financial incentives will work. So the problem there is also we do not have experience in that field, especially also when thinking about maybe designing a temporary pandemic-specific financial instrument. So with usually financial instruments, incentives, well, they are established and they are long-lasting. I am not aware of any instrument or scheme that is temporarily designed. What countries now do, just starting, Austria, for example, is giving some one-time money for training companies. Maybe in 2 or 3 months, they have to give a second time some money. We don't know yet so far. So countries are reflecting on that and a little bit experiencing in that, but there's no experience with respect to Corona. Why do companies train? Does money really matter? Well, you're all aware of that production motive, investment motive. So the basic, the center is the company's interest and investment in its own future skilled workers. Of course, there's also screening motives, reputation motives, social responsibility motives that companies have. Why to engage in dVET and train young people? And of course, that comes also makes sense in a very economic way. These kind of cost advantages, you are very familiar with that. It's reducing recruitment costs, orientation, induction times, because otherwise you would have to hire graduates from other educational tracks, and then you have to give induction training to them at the price of at least minimum wages. And usually the wages for apprentices are lower than the wages than the minimum wage. Also, dVET, you know that labor turnover is reduced often, incorrect choices are avoided, and you have lower downtime costs due to the lack of skilled workers. So my last slide and the last aspect I would like to share with you is the question, does money really matter? And from my point of view and my experience is that especially when going to countries that have full-time school-based VET system and that tried to go to the direction of dual VET or introducing dual VET work-based learning elements in their IVET systems, the problem arises the low training engagement of companies. But one has to really question the reasons for that. And from my point of view, often the framework, the setting that is there for dual VET for training companies does not fit the interest of companies. And if a company is not interested in it and doesn't, and if it doesn't make economic sense for them, they will not engage in dual VET. One example might be, or one story might be, the dominance of school over company training. Often these still school-based systems that go direction of dual VET, the school is dominating company training. The school has the steering wheel, so to say, in hand. For example, when it comes to selection of students, first school choice, then placement into companies. Or when it comes to check if a company fits the requirements to be allowed to train, or when it comes to the assessment of the learning progress of apprentices in the company. Often this is done in the right and the obligation also of schools. So that's a setting that is very questionable from my point of view. You know all the story about outdated occupational profiles and dual VET programs. A very big issue in many countries are administrative hurdles. So if you have a very complex system, very criteria-based, challenging, demanding system to become a training company, then well, it's you might not wonder why there's no one who would like to join a dual VET. And also a very big issue often is companies simply do not know about regulations. So it's an information issue, and very important, often, of course, they do not have experience in training young people, in educating young people. They are missing training competence. And I would say if these situations prevail, then financial incentives will have no, or at least only a limited effect. And maybe, or well, it's my assessment, I'm quite sure about that. If you think how to invest money, and especially public money, I would rather go for building up support structures and tools for training companies. Not just giving money to training companies, but really to build up support structures that support training companies in the training of their young people. If there are problems, giving and information, qualifying instructors, all these things like that. And especially the idea is not just having some kind of general information tools and things like that. That must be very locally, so that the concrete training company or the company that is interested in starting dual VET might have a partner locally there where it can address and get support. So all in all, I would say there's a lot of aspects when considering incentive schemes, but maybe a lot more of reflection is needed in what circumstances incentive schemes might work and in what situations incentive schemes does not make sense anyway.